Okay, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the second day of the Search for Common Ground in our virtual week here at Traditions Week 2024, the 30th year of Common Ground on the Hill and its Traditions Weeks. Um, Welcome to all of you, and you will be able to find this Search for Common Ground class later on our YouTube channel. Um, and I think you'll find this of great interest. Let me start things off with, once again, a description of the intention of this course, which is our flagship course. In this, our flagship class, we draw from our experience as artists and human beings to have a dialogue arising from our life together here in community and in the larger society. In an atmosphere of trust and safety, and inspired by song, images, and story, and in this instance, film, we will listen to and learn from the voices of our sisters and brothers from communities represented in our circle. We gather at Common Ground on the Hill, our 30th summer. Now put on your seatbelts. In the midst of a world stricken by climate disasters, while trying to emerge from a 4-year pandemic, financial and ecological crises, wars, never-ending nuclear threats, racial crises, the continued unveiling of systemic abuse, issues of immigration and survival, the omnipresent threat of terror, both foreign and domestic, and counterproductive divisive politics. Yet, we also find ourselves at a time of potential for great needed change. We shall discuss and consider what we're doing as artists and individuals to bring about the changes and create the communities that we desire. That's a lot. It's a lot. And I think we all feel a number of those things. And so, what are we doing here? Well, this is where we search. We're searching for answers. Maybe we're searching for questions. And we're focusing this search class on last night's keynote. How many of you managed to see the keynote in the class there? So I know I was there. I saw it. So
I saw it. Yeah, it was good.
Pam saw it, and Becky. Um, Anyone else? It just helps me understand, what how we need to approach this.
Uh,
So what we watched last night was this wonderful film, and I won't talk too much about the film itself, but what I will say is that Bill Troxler, who you see here, who is the founding president of the board of directors of Common Ground on the Hill, and the former president of Capital College, and now a wonderful musician living in Chincoteague, where oysters are consumed. And yeah, and some of the best, they say. And Bill came to this project as a recording sound engineer. And you see Richard here. This is Richard Anderson, who is the film expert. He's the person who puts the good touches on the film work of the filmmaker, which who we will talk about. And then we see Christine Kiner here, Dr. Kiner, who is a specialist on oysters, and we'll have her talk more about that. Bill Troxler got in touch with me a number of months ago and said, I think I've got a great idea for a keynote, and it's oysters. And I just sort of sat back and ordered a bottle of champagne and quaffed a few oysters and said, now, what are you talking about? And Bill told me about this film that he was working on that focuses on people from really disparate points of view and importantly, like life-sustaining differences, figuring out a way to get along, figuring out an answer. And it seems like that's what's missing so much in today's dialogues, if there is indeed dialogue anywhere, is people working together to find solutions. Should be simple. So I'm going to get out of the way here and let Bill fill in the gaps and introduce everyone else. And let's see where our conversation goes. And please, if you have questions, let us know. and we'll be looking at the chat, and you can raise your hand as well. So Bill Troxler.
About a year ago, Richard contacted me and asked if I would compose music for a film that he was working on. The film is a project created by Chesapeake Bay Journal. They have a media division that produces nature documentaries about the watershed of the Chesapeake Bay. And they're all quite wonderful. Richard had been working with the filmmakers for years, and his consistent complaint was, you're not using original music. You're buying stuff off the shelf and sticking it in, and it doesn't make any sense. And he said, would you be willing to write, I'll use Richard's upscale term, bespoke music to support the film? And I said, yeah, absolutely. That would be a thrill. My background is I've done a lot of composition work for live theater, so the transition to film was easy. We had made a couple of films together. They had worked, and so I was excited to get this. And you have to understand that doing a film like this is difficult. It requires a lot of pre-planning. There's scheduling that has to be done. Somebody's got to go out and do field recordings. Somebody's got to fix those field recordings with noise. Someone has to prepare the interview guide. It's a huge amount of work. And then someone has to edit this and put it all together so that it's coherent, it's seamless, contiguous, and makes sense to the viewer who's not familiar with this subject at all. That's what the filmmaker's role and editor's role is. Richard and I are part of the post-production team, meaning we get the film delivered and we get to sort of kick at it every now and then, say, no, we didn't like the transition. But our jobs are the following. I compose the music. Richard and I collectively work together to set sound levels of the narration, the nature sounds, and the music. And Richard also does something called color balancing so that the photography is more or less in the same color palette as we go along. None of this would have happened without Christine's scholarship. She is a Western Maryland now McDaniel College graduate who got her PhD at Johns Hopkins. And she wrote the book, and I do mean the book, that describes the relationship between oysters in the Chesapeake Bay and the people of the Chesapeake Bay. It's a look at a bit of biology, a whole lot of politics, a great deal of culture, and how those things came together to make an industry that was vital to Maryland and much of the East Coast, at least. So those are the roles we have. Richard and I are not subject matter experts. We can talk to you about how the film was made, but Christine is our, she's our Fort Knox in terms of the information about the program. And did I cover everything, Christine and Richard, that hit it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the filmmakers had to make all kinds of choices. Like it could have been, a Ken Burns 12-hour series, really, instead of just 45 minutes.
So I think, as I said last night in closing the film, I think the key thing to take away here is how many minutes the credit roll runs, because it evidences the kind of skills that are involved, the kinds of perspectives that are involved, and that this short 42-minute film took a huge number of people to collaborate to make it possible. Just as the oyster status in the Bay right now takes a huge number of people to try to bring this population back to stability. And fierce. And pulling this all together, I think, is a masterstroke. Hats off to the state of Maryland, the watermen and the scientists who have come together in a feeling of trust to make something, to make a very expensive experiment to go forward for more than a decade now. Maybe what the three of us should do is just sort of open this up to questions and see if our participants want to address something in particular. Does that make sense?
I have one quick question. We know that oysters are great for water. They clean up the water. But here's my question, and the scientist among us would probably know the answer. So these oysters filter the water, clean up the water, where does that, where do those nasty things go? I mean, are they retained by the oysters? Are they, is the pollution transformed in some way? What happens?
They essentially, work as denitrification agents. So, yeah, they are filtering the water, and then of course they're excreting, nutrients like nitrogen. So, yeah, it's still in the sediment, but yeah, the more oysters you have filtering the water, of course, the better it's going to be.
So, but the sediment is still filled with the nitrogen and all that sort of thing.
Hmm.
Uh-huh. So it doesn't do away with it. It merely puts it somewhere that's not bothersome.
Well, it takes it out of solution.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Now, it can be suspended in solution, or it can be like on the bottom.
Right. Well,
Which
thanks.
is
Inquiring minds wanted to know.
uh-huh.
The technical term that the scientists use for this is eutrophication of the bay. And that describes a process where these chemicals come in that disrupt the balance of the water and make it difficult both for plants and animals to grow. The second piece of that problem is runoff of solids. That is to say, construction sites where you have dirt, sand, clay, whatever it is running into the bay. What a lot of people don't understand is the Chesapeake is a flooded river channel. It is the river channel of the Susquehanna River. The headwaters of the Susquehanna are in upstate New York. So if you're going to clean the bay, you've got to start working on the Susquehanna from New York through Pennsylvania into Maryland and finally into the bay. Roughly 50% of the fresh water in the bay comes from the Susquehanna River. If you don't clean up the Susquehanna, you're not going to clean up the bay. And one of the major choke points along the Susquehanna is a dam called the Conowingo Dam. And when we get these terrible storms like hurricane or a nor'easter and there's great flooding in Pennsylvania and New York, that dam has to hold back water. And eventually it has to be released. And that's when a whole gush of these sediments can go and fill into the bay. There is no simple system like the bay. These estuaries are incredibly dynamic and incredibly complicated, and one life species feeds on another, hurts one another. I mean, it's really, the scientists who study this stuff, they're just dealing with such complexity. It's amazing.
Any more questions? There must be some.
I have one that is maybe I missed it during the movie last night, but I know as they're making all these taking all these gametes and creating more oysters, in the labs there in the farms or the nurseries, I guess they're called. They reach a point, I think, where she said where they have a little foot where they can be attached to a shell. So I guess my question is, where does that shell come from? Like I go to oyster feasts, bull and oyster roasts, where they collect all the shells and I think they reintroduce them to create more reefs and whatnot. Are they just used shells that they're using? Do they somehow create shells?
That's a great question. And shell is the limiting factor. There's been, a scientific struggle to find enough shell for, decades, going back to the early 20th century. It seemed like everything had been solved in the 1950s when these vast deposits of fossilized, or at least very old oyster shell were found on the bay bottom. So it was mined out like a resource. And it did cause a lot of controversy. Recreational fishermen argued that it would stir up the sediment and scare away fish. So eventually, the state did prohibit it, and then it led to trying to buy oyster shell from other states. So yeah, still today, finding oyster shell is a real struggle, and all kinds of alternative sources of culture have been tried over the years, slag, concrete, the remains of Memorial Stadium, where I saw the Orioles play in the 1980s, that wound up being used for oyster bed restoration. But
So do even oysters that reproduce naturally, not within our nurseries, do they also like reattach to vacated shells, I should say? That is that how that so there's just a finite number of them. Okay.
yeah, they do need a hard substrate. Otherwise, the baby larvae will just sink into the mud and die.
Right.
So, but they create their own shell, however, right? After they've attached to something else.
Oh, is that correct? Okay.
Yeah. In the movie, there was a little sequence there where they were showing these different things that can be used instead of shell, like these woven net-like things. One was made out of basalt, another was made out of some other natural material. But the advantage of that technique is that those things can be like attached to piers or attached to other things, and because the oysters just need a place to start.
Okay.
Like Walt says, they'll grow their own shell, but they need a starting point.
Gotcha.
They don't like grow into an old shell. They create their
Okay.
own shell.
They just need
a
to have
place
something
to
to-
start. They need a hard surface
Gotcha.
that keeps them from like sinking down into the mud or whatever.
And then they produce it themselves. Okay.
Correct.
For a number of years, I've worked with a Virginia program to become an oyster gardener. And in that process, I go to the Virginia Marine Institute on the eastern shore of Virginia, and I buy a little bag of spat, basically. These are tiny, I guess they're beyond the spat stages, tiny, tiny little baby oysters. They're about the size of my little finger. And a bag of this, it's around 1,000 oysters to start with. And I take that home and I put it in a cage and I tie it to my dock. And a year later, I returned the oysters that have matured. And that year, that little thing on my, the size of my little finger will fit the palm of my hand. That's about the size of a year-old oysters. And from that little bag, I will return to the Virginia Marine Institute 3 5-gallon buckets of oysters. I don't eat them. And what they do is that they then put those on sanctuary reefs, just as Maryland is doing to try to rebuild the population. And that shell comes from the oyster pulling in the water, filtering it, and reserving some of that calcium that's floating around in the water and creating shell, just like a snail would do. I mean, it's the same sort of a process. It's fascinating to watch. I mean, it's slow moving, but it is fascinating to watch. Chincoteague, by the way, had its own version of oyster wars, shooting wars, and the perimeter of Chincoteague had like a tennis judge. They had those towers they sit up in, and people would spend the night with shotguns. And if someone would encroach on somebody's oyster bed, they would shoot them. I mean, this was a serious business at the end of the 19th century. Serious business.
I think these days they have little towers that have cameras actually and radar
Yeah.
to look for, vessels that are going into a sanctuary area. And if they detect that, they'll send a boat out to see what's happening,
I'd be interested to know, Christine, if you are still doing research, what are you up to now relative to this topic, or are you off onto another life?
No, I am still collecting material. I'd like to do another version of the book. It's not really coming up here. So it came out in 2009, and like when you see the newspaper article in the film of the governor like signing off on these radical new changes to try to open up the oyster leasing laws. Like that was December. So that was right after the book had come out. So I wasn't able to include like these massive new changes. I did write an article for the 10th anniversary of the book in 2019, in which I looked at the way that those incentives have kind of unfolded during that first decade. And I would like to follow up on that. I mean, a real problem is that all of the incentives that are in place, like there are all kinds of ways to get loans, but starting up an oyster farming venture costs as much as $60,000 an acre. So that was always the big concern of the oystermen, that they wouldn't be able to afford to get into it. And unfortunately, there have been some studies suggesting that it's really only white college educated men with business and STEM degrees who are mainly going into it. Like they are like more able to figure out all of the deadlines and to have all kinds of assistance. There are a few entrepreneurial oystermen of color getting into the business, but like looking at how like racial inequities and socioeconomic inequities might be being replicated with this transition from the fishery into private aquaculture, I think is definitely a concern that like anthropologists are looking at, and I definitely want to follow up on.
Christine, do you have any data about consumption of oysters? One of the points the film makes is that one of the people running an oyster shucking house says, I could double the business if I could sell my product. So are we consuming fewer oysters, about the same oysters? What's the marketplace?
It's definitely not the way it was in the 19th century, when it would be very common to order dozens and dozens of them at a restaurant, or there would be the food trucks of the day going around and shucking them. So yeah, I thought the point that one of the people in the film made, that it's a luxury food now, and people have long since gotten out of the habit of eating them. Like a big problem was in the 20th century when pollution was so rampant, and there were several students who died at an oyster feast in Connecticut around 1893. They spread typhoid. And then in 1924, there was another big outbreak. So it did lead to all kinds of new regulations for the shellfish industry, but other forms of protein became cheaper over the decades, like chicken and hot dogs. And it's definitely not something that I think is as well appreciated now. Like also around the 1980s is when the crab became like the symbol of Maryland, and that's actually really historically recent. It is interesting, whenever I go back to Maryland, I see all these cars that have crab stickers and magnets on them, but that was not a thing really when I was growing up there in the early 80s.
You know, no, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think the industry is actually a little bit shooting themselves in the foot, because I'm an oyster lover and I order oysters all the time, particularly when I go to Chincoteague. But it's disappointing because they don't wait long enough. They shouldn't harvest these oysters as soon as they do. Like a 2-year-old oyster is really not fit for consumption, in my opinion. And they charge too much for them, you know, like a 3-year-old oyster should be the minimum. But I don't know whether the reason they harvest them so soon is because they're afraid of MX and Dermo, or whether they're just trying to make the economic case that they need to get them sooner. Do you know anything about that, Christine? Like what would be driving the fact that they're harvesting them at 2 years instead of 3 years?
Um, I mean, that is one of the problems of getting into the industry. It takes, 3 or 4 years to really get established. And at any time, if there's a big storm, like that can cause the salinity levels to change so much that it'll kill off a bunch of the oysters. Uh, so there probably is a lot of pressure to at least make some kind of money off of it as quickly as possible.
Uh-huh. Okay.
One of the fears of food poisoning with, well, any kind of seafood, but in oysters in particular, if you go back to the 1840s and 1850s in New York City, oysters were incredibly popular. And a gentleman from Chincoteague, whose name was Thomas Downing, he was a born free African American who learned the waterman's trade here in Chincoteague. And he left for fear over Virginia's policy toward freed African Americans. This is prior to the Civil War. And he went to New York and he established his restaurant, which specialized in oysters. And because he understood the trade, he was able to go out into New York Harbor early in the morning and negotiate with the men who were harvesting oysters and fix a price, and then come in and bid. And these guys knew that he was good for the money. And so it was a very good business relationship. But New York in the mid 19th century was a foul place. There was no sewer treatment plant up there, and the harbor got contaminated with human waste. And the oysters carried that waste, and it made people really sick. And the oyster business shut down. And Thomas Downing, because of his connection to the Chesapeake Bay and Chincoteague, began importing oysters from this region to New York. That's what made the Chincoteague oyster stand out, because it does have a different flavor. It's saltier, because Chincoteague Bay is actually saltier than the ocean, and they were considered the A grade of oyster, and people would specify, I want Chincoteague oysters. In fact, they're called Chincoteague salts very often, and they really do have a different flavor. And by Thursday afternoon, Richard will be here, and we will be at Chatty's Lounge having a plate full of oysters and a couple of beers. I wager on that. What do you think, Richard?
I think they're going to be 2-year-old oysters, but I'm going to eat them anyway. I'm going to have to order twice as many, Bill.
Yeah, hardship.
Personally, I like Chop Tank sweets, which are
Oh,
not
they're very
salty.
good. Yeah,
That's
no,
my
they're very
preference, but I'll eat any kind of oyster. Chincoteague oysters will be fine.
We had a wonderful friend, Roland Hill, was a great supporter of Common Ground and Richard's best friend. And it would often come down to my place on the western shore of the bay, and people would complain about how the oysters weren't as salty as they should be. And Roland had a cure. It's called a salt shaker. A little bit of salt in there.
Yeah, true. I mean, if you put hot sauce on them, why not a little bit of salt? It's like. But anyway, yeah, I was said yesterday that if you go to the Chop Tank oyster farm there, you can get really big oysters. That's what I like. But anyway, well, thanks for that explanation, Christine. I could never get a straight answer out of any of these restaurants about that. Say, like, really? It's just the size.
It's picking up on Christine's history about the oysters. It's very hard for us to imagine how things were in colonial times regarding the oysters. The oyster was considered a menace. It was an impediment to navigation. There were such large oyster reefs that ships were running aground. I mean, really and they were there. If you look into the colonial records, there are all these efforts of how do we get rid of this reef of stone, basically oyster shells. They were a nuisance. They were not considered a delicacy at all. A nuisance. And here we are, total flip of that thing. We're trying to create oyster reefs these days.
Interesting. I know that an oyster reef is really a bad thing for a boat to run up on, because I've done that. It'll take the hull right off of a boat.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it will also absorb the storm surge from huge waves.
True.
So There are
True.
a lot of great restoration programs like around
Yes.
New York City now and Louisiana that the Nature Conservancy is
Yeah.
playing a big role in.
Yeah, especially now when we're going to have more and more in the way of storm surges. Yeah, true. True.
Well, we should ask our participants if there are still questions out there that you would like us to address.
I do have a question. I was interested in, I'm in the healthcare. I'm one of the nurses in Carroll County's public schools. When you were talking about that it made people sick, different time frames, it sounds like a few different times. What are the regulations with that? Like how do you know? Or is there testing that's done prior to an outbreak of, like you said, a bunch of kids at an oyster festival? Or how is that looked at and how is that regulated?
There are much stronger water quality standards now in place to start with, which was definitely not the case in the early 20th century. Lots of regular monitoring. I think that any like commercial oyster farmers have to adhere to all kinds of specific standards and sign off on them. But yeah, it was called the Shellfish Sanitation Program that started in 1925.
Okay.
And
All right, thank you. And
Yeah,
I did have another question about, I work at outdoor school and I think it's the supervisor of the STEM program with the county, Brian Shoemaker, goes around to the elementary schools and they make the cement reef balls with, I think it's either fourth or fifth graders. I was just wondering, I know he does that at multiple different schools within Carroll County. Is that something that's statewide? Are they trying to get a lot of the school kids involved and to learn about this program and what these reef balls do? Or is that just something that we do here in Carroll County, or even not just in the state of Maryland, other states like in Virginia and whatnot? Do they also do projects to help out?
I think there are programs like that at many states. I'm not sure how extensive they are, but there are even some programs where you can incorporate the cremated remains of human beings into reef balls and have a little memorial plaque on them. I think that's been done like off the coast of Florida for over a decade.
That's interesting. I never
Yeah.
would have thought about that. That's interesting.
You're gonna make me stop eating oysters.
I wonder, Christine, if I know that, I believe anyway, in that the crabbing industry, there's a great disparity between the laws of Virginia and the laws of Maryland, where in Virginia, they seem to think it's fine to harvest all the female crabs that they want. Is there anything like that in terms of the oyster laws and the fisheries in that way?
I mean, historically, there have definitely been major differences, and Virginia has had a much bigger commercial fishery, an aquaculture-based fishery for a much longer time. They've invested a lot in their like genetic improvement program through VIMS, Virginia Institute of Marine Science. Yeah, I haven't looked recently that much at how the regulations have changed, but definitely over the course of the 20th century, there was like much more incentives for private farming.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of the Susquehanna, you're talking about New York and Pennsylvania. And their nitrogen laws or whatever you might want to call them. So it's difficult. Everything runs downstream, and if you're not living downstream, then you don't know the problem.
I think Maryland versus Virginia, the truth is that both Maryland and Virginia have a vigorous scientific commitment to the health of the bay. There's a lot of good science being done on both sides of the border. The distinction is a political distinction. Maryland is, well, how should I put it? It's fairly liberal in the sense of lawmaking. It tries to provide laws that guide industries into certain kinds of performances, whereas Virginia tends to be much more of an open market kind of a place, and we don't want to have too many regulations. So, as Walt indicated, not only can you harvest female crabs, you can harvest crabs throughout the winter for a longer period of time. The crab season doesn't shut down, so it's just a more kind of I don't want to say Wild West, but it's a more open kind of political culture and regulatory culture here in Virginia.
Well, this is crabs now, but I went sailing recently, and as Richard knows, you don't want to run into a crab pot with a sailboat. Richard dove off the end of my sailboat last, I believe it was November, and freed up my keel from an errant crab pot rope. But when I went sailing a week ago, there were crab pots all the way out to the channel marker, all the way. So, I don't know if they're overfishing, it seems to me, and it's no longer is it the small fisherman, small crabber. It's a major thing with several power boats, and they're just running rampant. And I would imagine the same kind of, if we didn't have this kind of working together and science trying to work with the watermen, things would be out of control.
I think Kathleen had a question.
I do. I actually have two. So first I want to say hi, Richard. It's great to see your face.
Thank you.
Secondly, for Bill, you created the music, and I'm curious, did you create, did you have a vision in mind beforehand, or did you have to see the video before you could, how did the music get created? And then my second question was, for the video, is it something, because I didn't see the keynote speaker last night, we were traveling, and my internet was not working, so I'm hoping to catch up on that tonight. Is the video something that, for those fourth graders who are doing those reef balls every year, is it something that's geared for them, or what is the audience that it's geared for?
Richard, why don't you take the focus on who is it aimed at?
Who is it, what?
Who's the film aimed at? What's the target audience for
well, the Bay Media Journal has an audience of anybody interested in ecology, number one, but specifically the ecology of the Bay, the Chesapeake Bay. That's their constituency, and it's a large and well-heeled constituency. There isn't much trouble raising the funds for this kind of movie. Dave Harp has been doing this regularly because there is such a interest and a constituency. So that's the audience, but then it does draw in anybody who happens upon this film, because it's actually fascinating to see how these things work. It's beautiful scenery. It's boats, it's the bay, it's the oysters, and then the interviews are great. You have real people who are trying to figure this out and make a living, telling it like it is. It's a human interest story, number one, but it's specifically targeted towards the people who have an interest in the ecology and the economics and the culture of the Chesapeake Bay.
Kathleen, you asked about the music, and I'm going to try to answer that. It may not be fully satisfying, but here goes. I get the film in its final cut, meaning we've really got a film that's finished, except for color and audio. And I watch that film, oh, I don't know, maybe a dozen times, and I don't watch it with anything else going on. I don't take any notes. I just watch the film over and over and over so that I can internalize the rhythm of the film, um, where there's space needed for the dialogue and the images to be prevalent, and there should be quiet with the music. And there are places that there needs to be kind of a thunderous thing or a light thing. And then I always ask the filmmakers, what do you want? What's your expectation? What do you seek to have happen? And Richard's always very helpful with this because he gives me really pithy, short sentences. And I think in this one he said, I don't know, just make sure you make me cry. And if I get Richard to weep, I know I've done my job, right? But the technical part of how to do it, this is not going to be a satisfying answer because it's not like a kitchen recipe where you mix together these things and get the music. It's an art. And so I watched this film enough that I simply hear the music and I hear the orchestration. I know the orchestra well enough and the voices well enough. And these filmmakers are really kind to me. They give me latitude to experiment with sounds that they don't know, they might not understand, but they let me put it in. And then Richard and I will make the film and give it to the filmmakers, and then they comment, they give us feedback and say, no, not here, more here, you didn't cover this. So it's an iterative process. It's a really collaborative effort where I am sort of the creative technician, subject to the will of the filmmakers, because in the end, it's the filmmaker's film. It's not my film, and it's not my music. It's about conveying the message of the film, and the music is in service to that goal. You have to have the chops. You have to have the basic skill of understanding music theory and how that stuff works. And in terms of the orchestra, what most people don't realize today is very few movies, unless they're A-list movies, actually uses real musicians. It's too expensive. A recording day for a major film is $1 million a day. It's a big studio. It's probably 90 musicians. It's really complicated. And most films don't have the budget, and most nature documentaries do not have the budget. Years ago, a guy from Germany who was playing in a rock and roll band in England got to figure out synthesizers, keyboard synthesizers, and how they worked. And he started programming them. And he got this idea that, well, if I can make these weird, bizarre synthetic sounds, I ought to be able to capture natural sounds and let the key play that natural sounds. And he spent years collecting violins and trumpets and all the classical orchestra kinds of things. And he built this library so that he could sit down at his rock and roll keyboard and summon an orchestra. The guy's name was Hans Zimmer. He's one of the most productive, award-winning composers of cinema music in the world today. And he started this whole digital thing before the digital age happened. And today there are 3 or 4 subscription services in the world that a composer can subscribe to. And you have not just a violin or the violin section, but you have as many as 6 microphones that you can adjust in terms of volume and position. You have dozens of articulations, and you can change these on the fly. So as Hans Zimmer really gets upset when people will say to him, well, you didn't really play the music. And he said, yes, I did. I played it on the keyboard. The sound comes out of the violin that I recorded. And that's the way all of his preliminary music is done. And they decide on the music that Hans writes before they call in the orchestra. In the old days, a composer sat down at a piano and said, here's what I want to compose for this part of the movie. And the director would say, yeah, go do it. They would hire an orchestra, record it. As the film was running, he would direct, or she would direct, the orchestra to play at the right time. That's not the way it's done these days. It's done on digital keyboards that may only cost $100 and a digital audio workstation that may only cost $100. And the subscription service for the quality of what they produce is ridiculously low. For about $30 a month, you can have access to over 12,000 instruments on your keyboard. It's an amazing thing. Now, it's another skill you got to learn, but it's just stunning. It's a lot of fun.
So
Did
I'd
that
like
help?
to say some, I'd like to say something too about. Oh, sorry. Are you finished?
I was going to ask Kathleen, did I come anywhere near answering your question?
Yes, you did. Yeah, I was wondering what the process was, and you did a great job of, I didn't know if you like had it in your head first but it
No,
makes you watch the
my own
movie.
view is that would be absolutely the wrong thing to do. You should not walk into a project like this with your mind already made up. What's important is for you to absorb the film and have that film make up your mind, and you respond to that. I'm not trying to get the film to respond to me. I'm trying to get my music to respond to the film so that the viewer can embrace the film more thoroughly. That's my job. I can sit down and compose anything, but so what? It's part of this collective effort to make the film meaningful to the people who see it. So you can't start with an answer. You have to start with a question.
So I
hate being so vague, by the way, but
Yeah.
that's the process. It's vague.
Well, let me add to what Bill says, because I think he's leaving something a little bit unsaid here. So when I work on a film, I think of it as scene by scene, scene by scene. And it's almost like every scene has to have its own song written for it. Like your daughter's a songwriter or whatever, a musician, and she thinks in terms of the song. Each song is its own separate little entity. Well, in a film, you just have each scene will have its own composition, its own feeling, its own song, so to speak. Is that accurate, Bill?
Oh yeah, that's more than accurate. It's actually historic. If you go back to the early days of sound in the cinema, it was terrible. They had no idea what to do. And if you look at the films, say around 1930, often there was no music in the core of the film. They patched in some classical piece at the beginning and at the end, and that was it. And it was awful. So if you watch the 1931 movie Dracula, they're playing a ballet up Swan Lake, right? And it's this dark kind of a thing. Well, I guess but there's no music in Dracula. It's only at the beginning, at the end. And in 1933, 32, 34, there was a young man in Austria who was a Jew, and he fled Europe to get away from Hitler. He was the rising star of classical music, especially opera, in Europe. And he was going to be the guy for the next decades. His name was Max Steiner, but he left and he went to England, and he couldn't get much work. And so he left England and he went to New York, and he didn't get a whole lot of work. And some friends called him and said, why don't you come out to LA? They don't know what they're doing out here and they need music. Maybe you can find some work. So he went out and he wrote a few things. And this producer called him and said, listen, I'm making a film and I want the best music in the world. I don't want the stuff that we've done. I want something totally new and breathtaking. Will you take the project on? And he did, under the condition that he didn't have any artistic control from directors or producers. They just let him run. And Max Steiner set about to write an opera. And as an opera, we have something called leitmotif. So every time a major character comes on board, there is a theme song that's played. It may be played fast or slow, it may be major or minor key, but you know that melody is attached to that character. And there are times when multiple characters come on and the themes play together. That's the magic and the artistry of the whole thing. Max Steiner did this. He even wrote an overture for a movie, right? There's like a 4 or 5 minute overture, just like you would have in an opera. That film, by the way, is the 1934 production of King Kong. Max Steiner went on to score more than 300 films. He was top of the game in his era. He scored Gone with the Wind. He did all sorts of stuff. So when Richard talks about scene by scene, we go back to Max Steiner and his approach to treat film as though it were a storytelling event, just like an opera is a storytelling event. Does that do justice to it, Richard?
Yeah, I just wanted to get that point across. That's because I think what Kathleen was looking for was the logistics of it, like where do you start and how do you carry through, right? Is that right?
Yes, that's what I was looking for, logistics.
So we've been talking about sight, video, film, and sound. And I'd like to ask Christine what your writing process has been in this book. How did you approach it? And were you a get up in the morning and write person, or did you drink tons of coffee and sequester yourself for days on end? How did this book happen?
It started out as my dissertation to graduate from my PhD program, and I actually never thought it would become a book. I didn't look at it then for 4 or 5 years after I finished the dissertation, for which I drove all around Maryland, going to a bunch of the county historical societies, and I spent a lot of time at the Enoch Pratt Library in downtown Baltimore, going through the Baltimore Sun on microfilm. And then the first couple presses that I had approached rejected it. And then I found my publisher kind of serendipitously. So I still tend to be a binge writer, like writing a lot during the summer, trying to set a word count each day, definitely relying on a lot of coffee. Another question I sometimes get from people outside of the university world is how much money did you make? And the answer is almost none.
Right.
Academics don't write books to make money. Walt, you had asked me last night if the documentary helped my book, but I don't know, because I only get royalty checks every 2 years, and it's usually only double digits at most. So it really is a labor of love, and I do feel very fortunate. It helped me advance in my career as a professor. But yeah, I do want to hopefully do a sequel to look at all the momentous changes that have occurred since the 2009 to 2010 legislative changes.
Well, it's hard to imagine, but we're 1/4 of the way through this century, and
Wow, yeah.
yeah. Well, this has been wonderful to get inside the heads of these people who made this film happen, and the missing person is the filmmaker. And give us his name again.
Dave Harp.
Dave
And,
Harp.
Dave Harp. Harp.
Dave is actually, one of the reasons Dave is not with us is he's making a film. So he is, along with Tom Horton, who narrated The Passion for Oysters, they put together a film project called Chesapeake Rhythms, and they're looking at the comings and goings in the Bay. Richard and I this week will finish the work on Tundra Swans. It's about a 6-minute segment. Dave has finished filming the shorebirds, and he's been filming butterflies. And I know he's on his list to film are eels and horseshoe crabs, and I think he's going to do something with tides, and this will be released in 2025. So Dave is in the field capturing footage. I have to tell you, the Tundra Swans thing will take your breath away. Oh my God. He did a lot of the winter filming at Blackwater Refuge, which is on the eastern shore of the bay, in snow, watching the largest waterfowl bird we have in North America. It's just, I think Rich will tell you, just boy, it's eye-popping stuff. It's beautiful. So that's why Dave is not here. And I should say a little bit of a credit to Dave's role as a father. His daughter is the president of Chesapeake Bay Foundation, so it runs in the family these days.
Wow. Oh, so, Christine, where can people get your book?
Oh, it is available on Amazon, and also the University of Georgia Press website too. Yeah,
And of course,
not really showing up.
people could always get in touch with us at Common Ground on the Hill, and we can steer them in the right direction. It seems like these days you just Google something and you can find it.
Yeah. Well, it's a great book. I read it a couple of times before and after I helped out with the interview of Christine, and it's a great book. I mean, the scholarship is first rate.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for being part of this. And I'd like to say that tomorrow's artist will be Sheila Arnold, a wonderful storyteller who Bill told me about. That's how we managed to find Sheila. And she has been storyteller in residence at Mount Vernon and many other places. She's just a great, great storyteller. And I'll be interested to find out what she's been up to. You know, we lost touch with a lot of people, in-person touch because of the pandemic. And it's interesting to see people, you know, back out and doing the work. So thank you all for showing up. And then on Thursday, we have Rod McDonald, who will be talking to us about the, his music and his process as a songwriter, but also his work with the Greenwich Village Folk Festival, which is an ongoing virtual festival looking back to the 1990s when it was created, looking back to the 1950s in Greenwich Village. So it's an ongoing community. That'll be a good one. And then on Friday, we'll have Leah Gilmore, who is the recipient of the Robert H. Chambers Award this year. So thank you all, and be good to eat other and eat lots of oysters. Really high in lots of good things for you.
Thank you, Walt.
Thank you.
Thank you.